Let me start with you, Mr. Usher. Firstly, if you were to take people through some of the contentious issues around the climate fund, what are these issues?
There's quite a range of issues today. The committee, which was the transitional committee, which was formed after the last COP in Cancun, has been working for the past year and has met a total of 4 times to design the instrument. And the final meeting, which was in Cape Town a month ago, they came up with a draft design. They came close to agreement, although there were still some outstanding issues, and mostly those issues are the ones that are being elevated to the negotiations taking place these 2 weeks in Durban.
What are these issues?
There are quite a range. One of the main area of issues is exactly how the fund will relate to the Conference of the Parties, which is the COP. How it will be accountable to the Conference of the Parties, but how it will remain its operational ability to operate as a fund in terms of how it raises and disperses the most effectively these public resources. And there's the parties or the countries negotiating the agreement are not in full agreement on how close it should be to the Conference of the Parties in terms of its accountability. So many of the outstanding issues relate to that point. There are some other issues that are still not on full agreement, including the role of the private sector. The instrument has been designed based on the understanding that because of the very significant level of investment that needs to be mobilized, both to help countries move to low carbon pathways and also to build up their climate resilience, there's just not enough capital within the public coffers and within public treasuries to finance the entire response, and therefore we will need to work with the private sector. We will need to help mobilize their investment, but different parties or countries have different views on exactly how best that can be done.
Ultimately, then, you sound very optimistic about it. It sounds like there will be an agreement. Is that your view?
It's very hard to predict today. There's still a long ways to go. I think most parties are satisfied with the design and the structure of the document. The document being the draft instrument and essentially how the fund will operate. But, you know, in these types of negotiations, it's never over until it's over. And we will see, probably down to the wire, whether or not the parties can come to agreement.
Dominic, what is your view? Do you think that we're closer to an agreement?
It would be hard for me to say because I'm not close to the discussions themselves.
Sure.
From what I understand, that there is plenty of debate over this point that Eric made very well about the role of the private sector. And I think that's a fundamental issue to consider, is the size of the challenge versus the amount of money available. And if we're really serious about meeting the challenge, then how do we actually use this fund as a mechanism to catalyse much more money?
Here's another issue that people have raised, and perhaps, Dominic, I'm going to start with you. People have spoken, for instance, about where the money is going to come from. Is there an issue about where the money is going to come from?
I think there's a number of issues about the resource allocation. We've had a lot of debate, as far as I understand, about operational procedures and about committees, and as Eric was saying, about the structure of the instrument. But in terms of the public funds that will go into the Green Climate Fund, where are the checks, if you like, on the table? Number one, for the public money. And then number two, how do you best use that public money wisely to get much more money flowing into the infrastructure that we need?
So I just want to come back again to the issues of resources. People have raised issues, for instance, about how ultimately we are likely to be affected as taxpayers from different countries by the efforts to raise money to go into this fund. Is that an issue?
Of course it's an issue. The costs involved will be significant, as will the potential impacts if we are unable to mobilize the needed resources. The actual issue of what we call the sources discussion, how you source the financing that will be required, that is actually not within the discussion of the Green Climate Fund. It's actually at a higher level within the negotiations. They're creating a standing committee on finance, which is a committee essentially which will be trying to negotiate over time what sort of sources should be produced. There was a Secretary General's report prepared about 12 months back that Minister Trevor Manuel was part of, which was looking at what are the available sources that could come in various ranges of taxes, how carbon markets could be used, how shipping and aviation, different ways to raise different forms of financing internationally. And the conclusion of that report coming from the Secretary General was that it's possible but challenging to mobilize the required level of investment. And there are quite a number of options of how to do that. Each one of them politically will not be simple. There will have to be certainly a lot of back and forth about how do you agree, how do we structure the economy, what sort of instruments do we place in the economy to help create and mobilize the level of investment that will be needed. But it is possible.
All right, we'll come back to that issue in a minute because ultimately, I guess, people everywhere in the world would want to know as individuals then how are we going to be affected in as far as paying for this. People, for instance, saying that these proposed taxes on aviation will ultimately come back to my ticket as I want to fly from Durban to Johannesburg, for instance. Let's quickly then go back to Professor Patrick Bond on the line. Professor, are you there for me now?
I am, Kalani.
How are you doing this morning? Are you well?
Thanks for having me.
Are you well?
I'm very well, and it's exciting to be in Durban, especially this is the only concrete victory that the COP17 is expected to generate, the Green Climate Fund, but it's really up for grabs, and for the reasons you've said. I think, can we just back up, it's very hot politics, because Hillary Clinton promised this fund in Copenhagen, and she appears, in her government, Washington, appears to be reneging on the commitments required to actually build it. So it's an amazing moment where the climate debt that the North owes the South doesn't appear to be respected. And this is a shocking development because it was what everyone expected would be the sort of sweetener to support the Copenhagen Accord 2 years ago, the very weak deal that was done.
And then again, if they backtrack, and I'm talking about the Americans, if they backtrack then on that agreement, what is the impact on the fund going forward?
Well, yeah, look, the main point is the U.S. is very untrustworthy. We saw that in the Kyoto Protocol. They said, we'll sign that in 1997 if there are carbon markets. Now, then the carbon markets are being brought into the Green Climate Fund. Trevor Manuel, the co-chair of the design team, said up to 50%. People are even saying higher. But then you have to say, well, what is the state of the carbon markets? And by all accounts, they've crashed. And to actually rely on carbon markets to fund this is insane. I would challenge our colleagues, our guests, to say, can you, with any legitimacy, expect the carbon markets, which are at about €8 a ton, they were 33, and Union Bank of Switzerland expects them to crash to 3. Can you legitimately expect carbon markets to support this? Is that fair? Is it right to have big corporates involved in this? It's really a climate debt being paid by the North, and it just doesn't seem appropriate to start this gambling with carbon markets as a large part of the revenue.
Well, let's get a response then from my other panelists here on the program. Dominic, starting with you, how would you respond?
Well, there's a very legitimate point there about the scale and liquidity and depth of carbon markets. And in time, a decade, 2 decades, they might come on stream. So the professor is absolutely right about sources of funding in the short run. I think the issue must be put in the context of economic development rather than just climate alone. And if one is looking to enhance and upgrade infrastructure, power stations, energy access, transportation, these can be productive investments in the economy, create jobs, hit the balance sheet, improve GDP. How then do you use a little bit of aid to trigger a lot more investment domestically to make that happen, make the economy stronger? That really is the heart of the question. And to that extent, it's not really a public-private discussion. It's about growing a resilient economy for people to thrive and live in.
Professor Bond?
I disagree. I think this is fundamentally a moral problem that the North owes the South. The North did the damage. The continent of Africa is being cooked. We might see 150 million people die this century. This is really genocidal proportions, and there has to be some compensation going to ordinary people. If your guests are saying, oh, just more of the same, we're just going to see more subsidies for the Anglo-Americans and BHP Billiton. They get the cheapest electricity in the world here, and that's the kind of greedy corporate fund, GCF, greedy corporate fund critique from civil society, that the people designing this are just part of the 1% elites, and they're just helping each other out. So I think there's a big credibility gap, and until they show that ordinary people suffering from climate change, we lost 10 people in the storm on Sunday night, right? So we have tremendous damage, 350,000 people a year dying as it is. How are they going to get compensated? Does the Green Climate Fund have any way to get ordinary people, or we're just going to see people like Kingdom Swaziland, take the money from the Green Climate Fund, use it for its harem, instead of putting it into ordinary people's pockets.
Let me once again get a response for you then from Dominic. Yeah, I like the fact that GCF is no longer Green Climate Fund, but Greedy Corporate Fund.
Well, it's all good fun. I would going back to the professors. It's why the debate is so lively, as Eric was explaining earlier. We face a problem of unprecedented scale, and the professor's absolutely right in terms of the potential impact on human lives. But what are we going to do? What are we going to do? Do we accept that perhaps the way that overseas development assistance has been spent previously has worked? Really? Is that the most effective use of public money, a subsidy, a grant? Or do we really want to kind of trigger much more investment in an economy to build the kind of clean, green infrastructure, jobs and growth that people want going about their daily lives, together with adequate compensation for where it's needed for those who are hit most?
Let's take a step back then. Do you agree with the professor that the North, as he puts it, must take a bigger share of the responsibility, so to speak?
The fact that there's a commitment to build an unprecedented fund to try and tackle the problem would indicate that those feelings are being responded to, I would suggest.